today on Hot Nights and Cold Bodies. On a steamy July night, the quiet atmosphere in a sleepy Middle Tennessee town was forever shattered by a triple homicide. For 16 months, residents of the town looked over their shoulders until the suspects were brought to justice. Our story today is not only that of a triple murder and the people who committed it, but also of the dogged determination of a group of small-town detectives and police officers who dedicated their lives to bringing the accused to justice. Today you will hear from Rick Hall and Todd Spearman, two of the detectives involved from the initial crime scene all the way through the guilty verdicts. You'll also hear what could not be revealed during the investigation and trial. How exactly the television show America's Most Wanted played into solving the most heinous crime in the history of the town, as well as what Detective Hall told the grand jury to secure the indictments. Please be advised that this broadcast contains graphic descriptions of multiple homicide victims and may not be suitable for all audiences. For many years, Smyrna, Tennessee was no more than a bump in the road between Murfreesboro and Nashville. In the 1950s, it was home to Seward Air Force Base, which eventually closed and was taken by the local airport authority to host commercial and private as well as military aircraft. Virtually all of the businesses were on Lowry Street, where railroad tracks run parallel to the highway. Smyrna was known as a speed trap, with out-of-town motorists who dared cross the 30-mile-an-hour barrier being fair game. The town began changing in the late 1970s when the town mayor crossed the ocean and convinced a major automobile manufacturer to build a facility. With the factory came other supporting industries bringing jobs and residential growth. The town continued to grow over the years, reaching about 13,000 in 1990 and doubling to over 27,000 by July of 2000, but still maintained innocence. People were friendly and walked the streets without fear. I worked in Smyrna in 2000 as an accountant for a company at the airbase that serviced cargo jets. The Y2K fiasco had passed with no aircraft falling out of the sky. Smyrna was a good place to work, and my many co-workers described the town as a good place to live. There were 2 interstate exits leading to Smyrna, and I always took exit 70, which led me by Smyrna High School, then down the main thoroughfare, eventually leading to the main gate of the airport. On Wednesday, July 12th, I took my usual route, and I noticed a large gathering of police and emergency vehicles in front of the Captain D's restaurant. I went on by and wondered exactly what had transpired. Perhaps an overnight robbery, or maybe an injured employee. A couple of hours later, a co-worker told me the terrible news. 2 employees had been murdered during a robbery. A third employee had also been gunned down over 1,000 feet away from the restaurant and had been found in his car parked behind the local Kmart store. July 12th would be considered by many as the day the innocence was lost for Smyrna, and until arrests were made over a year later, local residents held their children closer and were more wary of their surroundings. Captain D's sits at 402 North Lowry Street in the heart of Smyrna. In 2000, it was bordered on the south by a BP gas station and on the north by a Shoney's restaurant. Just to the north of those locations was what was considered one of the main shopping attractions of the town, a strip center anchored by a Kmart store. North Lowry Street was, and still is, a mishmash of businesses ranging from car lots, tire and auto repair stores, and restaurants, as well as a funeral home and the old train depot. If one wanted to go shopping or go out to eat, North Lowry was the destination. The area was well lit, as I can testify to, having been there many times after dark in the months leading to the murders. It was sizzling in Smyrna on July the 11th. The temperature hit 97 degrees and was still hovering in the low 80s with no rain and no wind. when Captain D's closed at 10 p.m. There were 4 employees to handle cleanup duties. 3 of them had barely more than 2 hours to live. Brian Spate was the assistant manager of the restaurant. The 29-year-old was born in Washington, D.C., and spent his early years in Los Angeles with his mother and stepfather. His early years were described as tough by his aunt, who also said there was physical and substance abuse problems at the home, along with other unspecified incidents. Spate moved to Nashville in 1998 and bought his first house, a brick and siding ranch house on Vista Cove in Nashville's Parkwood neighborhood. His neighbors said he lived alone and kept his property clean. Spate had been hired as the assistant manager at Captain D's on April 10th, just 3 months before his murder. He was considered to be a hard worker who would show up hours early for his shift just because he believed he was needed. Scott Myers was a manager trainee at Captain D's. Myers had worked in food services for more than 20 years, most of them with the Dairy Queen Company. He had worked for Captain D's for only 5 weeks. Tragically, Myers was on the last night of his training in Smyrna. He was set to leave the next day to be assigned to a Captain D's in the Memphis area. The 42-year-old had been married to his wife Julie for 15 years and had 3 daughters, ages 15, 12, and 10. His wife described him as a hard worker and a wonderful father. He was active in their church and spent a great deal of time with his family. 18-year-old William Troy Snell was a senior at Laverne High School and was taking summer classes in hopes of graduating that year. Troy Snell was described as a hard-working, kind-hearted individual who knew a ton of people and enjoyed cruising around Smyrna. His parents had helped him purchase his first car. At the time of his passing, he had made 1 car payment. Doug Wagner cheated death that evening and should buy his mother a dozen roses every day for the rest of her life. His mother, Lori Wagner, made a decision that would save her son's life. Instead of allowing Doug to be brought home by Troy Snell, she picked him up at the restaurant. The air is hot and stifling, and the moon 3/4 visible as the employees go about their duties of getting the restaurant ready for the next business day. At about 11 p.m., Brian Spate spoke via telephone to Dorian Clark, an employee of the Captain D's in Mount Juliet, Tennessee. Spate didn't say that anything was amiss at the restaurant, and they made plans to get together later that week. He said goodbye to Clark when he heard Myers in the background saying it was time to start the cleanup. A few minutes after 11, Scott Myers and Troy Snell left the restaurant and walked to the BP station next door and purchased a few items. Snell was observed on the station's video surveillance tapes at 11:14 p.m. Lori Wagner arrived at the restaurant a few minutes before midnight, and her son Doug clocked out at 11:51 p.m. Time records from Captain D's indicate that Troy Snell clocked out at 12:06 a.m., while Brian Spate did not clock out. Scott Myers had clocked out at 8:09 p.m., but had returned to the store to learn the audit closeout procedure. Wagner later testified that she saw Brian Spate and Troy Snell walking Doug to the door. Doug got in the car and they drove onto North Lowry Street. Within minutes, everything broke loose inside and outside the restaurant. Fast forward to about 2 a.m. North Lowry is quiet except for the faraway rumble of a passing train. A garbage truck rattles through the parking lot, its first stop, Captain D's. Driver John Pierce said later that there were 2 cars still in the parking lot, which was unusual as there were normally not any cars present. When he went behind the Kmart building at about 2:15, he noticed a sedan with the interior lights on. The driver's seat was reclined with a boy apparently asleep. Pierce tried to wake the occupant with some noise, but there was no reaction. He doesn't leave his truck, but instead notified his dispatcher, Wanda Jackson, to have the Smyrna Police Department take a look at the situation before he left the scene. At 2:22 a.m., the police department dispatched Patrol Officer Gretchen Woodruff to the area behind the Kmart. She observed a dark-color Mazda Protege sedan. Officer Woodruff's car camera showed her approaching the vehicle and shining her flashlight inside, and then backpedaling in horror. This is Detective Todd Spearman telling what happened at the initial crime scene.
When the initial officer showed up, and obviously the headlights on the vehicle were on, and so the officer thought somebody was asleep. So on further inspection, when the officer went to the passenger side and actually shined his light in, he could see that the person in the car, the young male in the car, had what appeared to be a gunshot wound to his right side of his head.
The body of Troy Snell was in the driver's seat, his head turned slightly toward the passenger side. She observed blood on his neck and his T-shirt. Although the ignition key was on, the vehicle was not running, and the lights did not appear to be on. Snell's wallet lay in his lap, and his foot was on the brake pedal. There was still plenty of gas in the tank, but the car battery was dead. Snell had been shot once in the head from a distance of approximately 6 inches. There were no signs of a struggle, and there were no bullet holes in the car or window, which likely indicated that Snell was not running away from his murderer. Detectives were immediately called to the scene to investigate a potential suicide. This is Detective Rick Hall's first involvement with the case.
First of all, I got called. I was a detective on call. I'd actually taken it for another. Jeff Peach was another. He's a city attorney now, but he was having to go to Atlanta. So I took his on call for that one night, and I got that call at 2 o'clock in the morning. I think they basically called and said we had a suicide that occurred behind the Kmart on Lowry Street.
They noticed a Captain D shirt in the vehicle and sent an officer to the restaurant to determine if any other employees were present. Lieutenant Todd Spearman.
Well, we found this shirt and the apron, and it being close to what we thought would have been closing time. So we sent some officers, and 2 officers actually, to go over to Captain D's because the lights were on. And unfortunately, when we got there, there was the gentleman that sprays for bugs, the exterminator. He was there and said nobody else was in the building. So we left, and shortly thereafterwards, the exterminator, part of his routine was changing one of the traps in one of the coolers. And when he opened up the door for the cooler, that's where he saw the 2 other victims in the cooler and notified us, and we came over there and secured both scenes.
At 3 a.m., Michael Selly, the owner of Mike's Pest Control, arrived at the restaurant. He had a perfect right to be there. He had a key to the building and was performing the monthly pest control service. He also noticed 2 vehicles in the parking lot, and he found that unusual since he had never noticed the cars before. Once inside, he saw that the alarm system was not set, and that was also unusual. During his inspection, a police officer arrived and asked if there were employees or other people present inside. After assuring the officer that he was alone, Selly resumed his duties. In front of the cook line, he noticed a brown extension cord on the floor. The cord was leading into the walk-in cooler. Selly usually never had reason to open the door of the cooler, but this time he opened the door. Inside were the bodies of Scott Myers and Brian Spate. Myers' hands were bound by an extension cord that was wrapped around his upper body. Selly immediately called 911, and that call was received at the police department at 3:46 a.m. Upon being notified of another crime scene, Lieutenant Spearman went to the restaurant where he observed the scene in the cooler. Myers and Spade had each been shot once in the back of the head from close range in what the medical examiner would later testify were execution-style shots. According to Spearman, there were no spent bullets or shell casings in the cooler, and it did not appear that the bodies had been moved